While checking my hunting traps, I heard a roar that sent a chill down my spine. As I followed the sound, I witnessed the most haunting sight of my life, a Bigfoot. Being attacked by a bear. It wasn't fierce, it wasn't fighting back frantically. It was overpowered by the bear trying to shield its throat with trembling arms. Then it looked up at me. That gaze wasn't that of a monster. There was only fear, and something like a plea for help. And the moment those eyes met mine, I knew I had only seconds to make a choice. My name is Harold Jenkins, 58 years old, and I've lived off the forest for almost my entire life. I'm a hunter, the kind of man you'd call old school. I believe in footprints in the snow more than rumors on the internet. I don't believe in myths. I don't believe in monsters. I don't believe in Bigfoot. To me, the forest only held two things: prey and survivors. At least, that's what I used to think. 5 years ago, during a brutal winter, I witnessed a scene that no hunting book could have prepared me for. Since that moment, I no longer look at the forest the same way. And perhaps I am no longer the same man I was before. That winter arrived earlier than usual. I remember it clearly because it was only early December and snow already covered the roof of my cabin so thick that the front door wouldn't open unless I shoveled it out. People living in this area understand one thing: when a harsh winter arrives early, it doesn't let anyone go easily. But for me, the forest was never a place to fear. It's where I make my living, the thing that has fed me for more than half my life. I knew I shouldn't go out that day. The weather station had warned of a major storm surging down from the north. But in the forest, some things cannot wait. I had set traps along the western creek 3 days prior. If left too long, the catch would spoil and a week's effort would go down the drain. In this region, missing one harvest can mean a shortage of food for a month. I layered up, checking the hunting rifle that had been with me for nearly 20 years. I'm not the type who likes to carry a weapon just for a sense of security, but winter is different. When the snow is deep, predators are hungrier and more aggressive. A hungry wolf or a bear that hasn't hibernated yet can turn the forest into a death trap in seconds. As I stepped out of the cabin, the cold hit my face like a punch. The air was so dry and biting that every breath stung my lungs. I pulled up my collar, locked the door behind me, and began walking into the forest along the familiar trail. Everything around was unusually quiet. No birds, no snapping branches, only the sound of snow unching under every step. It took nearly an hour to reach the first trapping area. The deep snow made every step heavier, and I had to use a wooden staff to probe for deep snow pits. Arriving there, I knelt and brushed the snow off the metal trap. Empty. Nothing caught except a few small hairs covered by the wind-blown snow. I wasn't disappointed. Trapping is a game of patience. I continued west where the small creek curved around the forest. That area usually had rabbits and martens passing through, and sometimes, if lucky, a young deer. But the closer I got, the more I realized something was wrong. Not because I saw something specific, but because I saw nothing at all. No animal tracks, no familiar trails. Everything looked erased overnight. I stopped in a forest clearing, frowning as I looked around. New snow can hide tracks, but it can't completely erase every sign of life that quickly. The instinct of someone who had lived their whole life in the forest began to ring alarm bells in my head. Then I noticed the silence. Not the pleasant silence of winter, but a heavy silence, as if the forest were holding its breath. I stood still for a few seconds, listening. The wind still blew, the snow still fell, but there was no other sound. And that was when I felt a sensation I rarely admit: unease. I tightened my grip on my rifle, unconsciously observing my surroundings more closely. The towering pines stood motionless, like giant silhouettes covered in white snow. Visibility was limited by the heavy snowfall, making everything in the distance blurry. In places like this, a small mistake is enough to pay with your life. I told myself I was just imagining things. The cold and isolation can make a man's mind play dangerous tricks. I'd seen young hunters panic just hearing the wind howl through rock crevices. I didn't want to be one of them. So I took a deep breath, adjusted my rifle strap, and kept walking. I didn't know that just a few minutes later, that silence would be shattered. And when it broke, it would bring something I could never forget for the rest of my life. Before we continue the story, please comment the name of the city or state where you live. I want to know how large our Sasquatch community is. I continued toward the western creek, but after only a few dozen steps, I realized the snow in front of me was not as pristine as I thought. Initially, I thought they were just indentations from snow collapsing under its own weight. But as I leaned down for a closer look, I saw something different. A long, deep indentation much clearer than natural marks. I knelt on one knee, brushing away the thin layer of snow covering it. Beneath was a footprint, not a claw mark like a bear's, not the hoof mark of a deer. It was a footprint with a shape almost like a human's. 5 toes, a rounded heel, a slight indentation in the middle, but it was quite abnormal. I'm not joking because it looked like a giant's footprint. The size was staggering. I placed my hand next to it for comparison. That footprint was nearly half again as long as my hand. And what chilled my spine wasn't the size, but the depth. It sank into the hard snow, nearly double the depth of my boot marks. Whatever left, this must have been incredibly heavy. I stood up slowly, eyes scanning the forest. No other boot marks, no snowmobile tracks, no signs of any hikers. And if someone were crazy enough to enter the woods in this weather without specialized boots, they would have frozen to death long ago. I followed the string of footprints for a few feet. They were very far apart, each stride unusually long. Not the staggered steps of someone lost, but firm, purposeful strides. Could be a prank, I told myself, but who would have the strength and the stupidity to pull a prank in a place nearly 30 miles from town in the middle of an approaching blizzard? A strong gust of wind swept through, blowing the surface snow and blurring my vision. When it settled, I realized another type of track crossed this area. Large claw marks pressed deep with dragging grooves behind them. Grizzly. I recognized it instantly. The front paw marks were large and round the claws clearly defined, and its direction of travel coincided with the direction of those giant footprints. I swallowed hard. A grizzly in the middle of winter isn't unheard of, especially if it was woken too early from hibernation or was starving. But what was rare was it walking parallel to something with a human-like step that was larger than any man I had ever met. The two types of tracks intertwined for a short distance, then abruptly became chaotic. The snow was churned up. Footprints overlapped, sank deep, and slid as if a violent struggle had taken place. My heart began to beat faster. I had seen grizzly attack sites before. I knew what they left behind. But here, there was no carcass, no scattered fur, only patches of snow stained a darker shade. Blood. Not much, but enough for me to realize something had just been injured and was still moving. I looked deep into the forest where the trees stood close like a wall. The trail continued forward into where the snow fell thicker and the light was dimmer. And then amidst the wind whistling through the pines, I heard it. A roar, not just one. 2 sounds overlapping. One deep and violent, familiar as every hunter's nightmare. And another sound deeper, prolonged, like the sound of someone trying to suppress pain. I tightened my grip on the gun. Instinct told me to turn around, but the part of me that had lived a lifetime in the deep woods urged me forward. Because whether it was a bear attacking a person or something else, I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard it. That sound was unlike anything I had ever heard in the woods. Initially, I tried to convince myself it was just a grizzly, a hungry, aggressive bear woken too early from its winter sleep. But the more I listened, the more I realized something was off. The first roar was deep and heavy, vibrating the cold air. I had heard that sound dozens of times. It was the sound of a bear asserting dominance. But then mingled within was another sound. It wasn't the scream of common prey, not the sound of an elk being torn, nor a wolf calling the pack. This sound was deeper, raspy, and drawn out as if issued from a chest larger than any animal I knew. And what sent a chill down my spine was, it carried a very clear sense of pain. I stood frozen for several seconds, letting the wind and snow lash my face. In the deep woods, sound is the one thing that never lies. It reveals what the eyes haven't seen, and sometimes it's the only thing that helps you survive. The roar sounded again, closer this time. Snow on the pine branches shook slightly, a few patches falling like white dust. The birds remained silent. There were no other signs of life. I swallowed hard, gripping the hunting rifle. Instinct told me I was standing too close to a predation I shouldn't get involved in. In such situations, a wise man would turn around, go back to the cabin, lock the door, and act as if he never heard a thing. I had already turned half a step, but then that sound rang out again. This time it wasn't a roar, but a short, broken sound, like someone trying to breathe through pain. A hoarse groan lost amidst the snowy forest, and I realized what made me unable to walk away. That sound didn't resemble a beast's. It was too close to a human's. An indescribable feeling rose in my chest. I had heard injured people in the woods before, hunters fallen into ravines, hikers with broken legs. The sounds they made in despair were not much different from what I was hearing now. Damn it, I muttered, my breath turning into a thick cloud of white smoke. If it were a person, I couldn't abandon them. But if it were a bear holding its prey, then charging in would only make me the next victim. I stood still for a few more seconds, letting my mind battle with itself. The wind grew stronger, blowing the snow on the ground, making everything in the distance blurry. The forest ahead was like a white curtain hiding what was waiting for me inside. Then the old instinct of a life spent in the woods spoke up. Not a hunter's instinct, but a survival instinct. To survive, you must know where the truth lies. I pulled up my collar, checked the magazine, and began walking toward the source of the sound. Each step was now slower and more cautious. I no longer followed the trail, but moved between the trees, trying to keep to the downwind side so the sound wouldn't be carried away. The roar became clearer with every meter I advanced. Now I could distinguish the rhythm of the struggle. Short silences, then the sound of snow being churned up, followed by a heavy impact echoing through the woods. This was no longer a simple predation. This was a war. I stopped behind a large pine trunk, crouching low. From here I could see the light ahead change. The trees thinned out, creating a murky clearing amidst the falling snow. The noise was coming from right on the other side. My heart beat so hard I could clearly feel every pulse in my ears. I took a deep breath, slowly peered around the tree, preparing myself for the sight I thought I was about to see. A bear devouring a deer, or worse, a person. But as I took one more step and saw the clearing ahead clearly, I realized I was wrong. What was happening before my eyes was unlike anything I had seen in my life. I leaned slightly past the pine trunk, trying to keep my breath very slow so as not to reveal my position. The clearing ahead appeared blurry in the heavy snow, but after just a few seconds, my eyes adjusted to the pale light. And then I saw it. A massive grizzly bear stood in the middle of the clearing, its thick fur covered in snow and blood. It wasn't just roaring, it was attacking something. Each swipe of its claws churned up the snow beneath, revealing dark red patches, spreading like ink on white paper. Initially, I only saw the shadow of a large creature beneath the bear, a giant black mass moving weakly. I thought it was a young elk or another smaller bear that had been ambushed. But then the creature moved. It raised a hand, not a foreleg, not a claw, an arm. That is exactly what I saw, not obscured by snow, not imagined because I was too scared. An arm with 5 distinct fingers, long, thick, covered in black hair, but the shape was so close to a human hand, it sent a chill down my spine. The massive fingers curled in desperation as they tried to push the bear's snout away from its throat. I felt my heart drop straight to my stomach. The bear roared, biting hard into the creature's fur-covered shoulder, shaking violently as if trying to tear off a piece of flesh. The sound of bone hitting bone was audible, ringing dryly amidst the cold space. The creature below emitted a deep, pained sound, unlike any beast sound I ever knew. It wasn't a howl, it wasn't a growl. It was a hoarse sound, like someone trying to scream but no longer having enough air. I forgot to breathe. The wind and snow still raged around me, but everything seemed strangled in that moment. I tried to see more clearly, eyes straining to the point of pain, and then the creature turned its head. Just a little, but enough for me to see its face. Not a beast's face, not entirely human. A flat face, almost human, but also like an ape, high cheekbones, a wide jaw, and eyes, wide in panic. It wasn't the look of a predator. It wasn't the look of a cornered animal. It was the gaze of a being that knew it was about to die. A coldness ran down my spine, sharper than the winter chill. A name popped into my head that I had never seriously admitted before. Bigfoot. I almost wanted to back away immediately. Every mocking story, every time I had brushed aside the rumors, all of it rushed into my head at once. But the scene before me was too real, too vivid to deny. The bear swiped its claws again, slamming down on the massive body below. Snow flew up, stained red where it landed. The Bigfoot tried to roll, using its other arm to block the blow, but it was clearly weakened. Each movement was slower, heavier. It was losing. I gripped the rifle so hard my knuckles were white. A part of me wanted to turn and run. Leave this place, return to the cabin, lock the door, and convince myself I had seen nothing. But I couldn't take my eyes off the scene. Amidst the white snow, 2 giant creatures grappled in the deathly silence of the winter forest. On one side was what I had known my whole life, nature, cruel, wild, and uncompromising. On the other side was what I had thought existed only in legends. And at this moment that legend was dying right before my eyes. The bear roared again, lowering its head to bite the opponent's throat. The fur-covered creature tried to raise its arm in resistance, but the movement was slow, desperate. The snow beneath it was almost entirely stained red. I knew there were only seconds left. If nothing changed, the thing lying there would die right in front of me. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe only a few seconds, but in my head time seemed stretched to infinity. The grizzly was still pinning the Bigfoot down, its massive jaws locked onto the black furred shoulder. Every shake of its head made the massive body beneath vibrate. Snow flew up, then fell, sticking to the blood in dark crimson clumps. I forced myself to look closer. The Bigfoot wasn't just large, it was gargantuan. Even lying on its side, I could estimate its height would be over 7 feet if standing upright. Broad shoulders, a thick chest arm so long that when raised, they could encompass the bear's entire head. A layer of dark fur covered its body, thick but not hiding the gashes bleeding beneath. But what I couldn't look away from was the face. As it turned its head to avoid the next bite, its gaze caught mine. The distance between us wasn't far, perhaps only 40 feet. Through the curtain of snow, I still saw those eyes clearly. Not yellow like a wolf's, not murky like a bear's, but a deep brown, deep and with a clear awareness just like a human. Its gaze swept toward me and then stopped dead on me. It was looking at me, not as a threat, but as a last chance. I felt a tightening in my chest. I have hunted my whole life. I have seen countless animals before they died. Their eyes usually only held instinctive panic, ferocity, or emptiness. But this gaze was different. It recognized what was happening. The bear suddenly released its shoulder and swiped down, aiming straight for the head. The creature managed to raise its arm to block. The impact created a heavy thud, audible even over the whistling wind. I saw the massive body convulse in pain. It was not small. In fact, under normal conditions, it probably had enough strength to face any hunter. But right now, it was at a disadvantage. One shoulder could barely move. Blood soaked the fur, clumping into dark patches from the cold. The bear backed off a step, roaring menacingly as if savoring the weakening of its prey. Its breath puffed out in thick white clouds. It was tall, heavy, and completely healthy. I realized I was shaking, not from the cold, but because the truth was becoming clear. The stories I used to mock might be real. Impossible, I muttered, though no one heard. That creature, Bigfoot, if I had to name it. It was trying to roll to the side to create distance. It braced its hands in the snow, trying to heave itself up. As it raised its upper body, I saw the muscles beneath the thick fur. It was strong, very strong, but it wasn't enough. The bear lunged before it could fully stand. The collision sent both massive bodies collapsing back into the snow, creating a thick white cloud. I heard a deep rasp and the sound of claws tearing into flesh. Then a cry rang out, this time clearer than ever. A pained roar, not a beast sound, not a human sound, but something in the boundary between. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A part of me wanted to close my eyes, turn, and run. Because if I didn't see, I could continue to live with the belief that this world was still simple, that there were only humans and animals, nothing in between. But I didn't turn away. I saw the Bigfoot try to push the bear off with its legs, its body twisting sharply. In that brief moment, it almost escaped. It knelt on one knee, gasping, head bowed, and then it looked toward me again. That gaze was no longer just panic. It was a plea. I never thought I would use that word for such a creature. But that is exactly what I saw. It knew I was there. It knew I had a weapon. And in some way, I felt it understood I wasn't a bear. I was human. And humans could change the outcome. The bear didn't give it more time. It stood up on its hind legs for a moment, tall and terrifying, like a living nightmare. Then it crashed down again, its entire weight focused on its opponent. The Bigfoot fell back. The snow shattered. I saw its giant hand clutch at the snow as if trying to find a foothold. Blood continued to spread beneath it. I knew I was witnessing its final minutes. If nothing changed, it would die there, and I would be the only one who knew it ever existed. That thought made my heart tighten in a strange way. Not because I had suddenly become merciful, but because I realized if this thing died, the truth died with it, and I would have to carry that secret for the rest of my life. The bear lowered its head, teeth bared, preparing for the decisive bite to the neck. I raised the rifle. The barrel shook slightly in my hand. The distance wasn't far, but enough for a mistake to be lethal. If I missed, the bear would turn on me. If I hit too hard, I might kill it, and if I fired, I would be officially intervening in what nature had decided. My finger rested on the trigger. The Bigfoot looked at me one last time. And in that moment I understood I was no longer an observer. I could no longer hear the wind. I didn't feel the cold cutting into my flesh. Everything narrowed down to a single straight line, the rifle barrel before me, the bear in the distance, and the dying creature lying beneath the blood-stained snow. My finger rested on the trigger. That moment lasted forever. I had pulled the trigger hundreds of times in my life. In the forest, everything usually happens fast, decisively. You shoot or you die. No time to think too much, but this time, it was different. Because this wasn't a hunt. This was a choice. I took a deep breath, gripped the stock tight, and pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the silence. The sound resonated through the deep forest, bouncing off tree trunks, reflecting back like thunder in a giant cave. A flock of birds somewhere panicked and took flight from afar, breaking the deathly silence that had covered the woods. The bear froze. Its head snapped up, spinning toward me. Its small black eyes locked onto me instantly. In that moment I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't come back from. Now I was no longer an outsider. I was the threat. The bear roared, the sound deep and vibrating as if issued from the earth itself. It released the Bigfoot standing tall on two legs, its massive frame clear amidst the falling snow. The distance between us wasn't far, too close for it to detect the intruder of its hunt. Before I could breathe again, it charged. No warning, no hesitation, only the primal instinct of a provoked predator. I felt the blood in my body freeze. Part of me wanted to run. Survival instinct screamed in my head that no one stands still when a mature grizzly is charging at them. But I didn't budge. I couldn't. Not because I was brave, but because I knew turning my back now meant death. I raised the rifle again. My hand wasn't shaking anymore, but my heart was pounding frantically in my chest. The bear grew larger in my vision, each step hitting the snow like a hammer blow. 30 feet, 25 feet, 18 feet. I pulled the trigger. The second shot rang out shorter, more urgent. The bullet struck the bear's shoulder. I clearly saw the massive body jerk. It veered to the side, roaring violently, a sound both painful and furious, making the air around me vibrate. But it didn't fall. I knew it wouldn't. A bear like that doesn't go down easily with one bullet, and now I had made it hurt and angry. This is the most dangerous thing you can do with a predator. It skidded to a halt, gasping blood beginning to dye the gray shoulder fur red. Its eyes were still locked on me, full of murderous intent. Time seemed to freeze. I didn't fire again, not because I didn't dare, but because I knew if I fired more, this would no longer be a warning. This would be a battle, one man, one injured grizzly, in the deep forest where no one hears the cry for help. The wind hissed louder, swirling snow between us. A thick white screen began to swallow the clearing, blurring both our outlines. The bear roared again, but this time it was different. No longer charging, not taking another step. It backed off half a pace, just a bit, but enough for me to realize it was considering. Predatory instinct and survival instinct were battling within the beast, just as the battle had taken place in my head minutes before. Blood flowed from its shoulder, dripping onto the snow in dark spots. Finally, it raised its head and looked straight at me. In that moment, I knew I had made a mistake I couldn't fix. The bear's gaze wasn't just angry, it was pure instinct, cold, calculating, and now in its eyes I was no longer a bystander. Damn it! I took a step back, then another. The snow sank deep under my feet, each step feeling pulled backward. I knew I couldn't outrun it, not in this thick snow, not at this close range. The bear lowered its head. Then it lunged. I turned and ran. No more thinking, no plan, only the rawest survival instinct. The heavy footsteps behind me sounded like thunder. Each stomp on the ground was a tremor that rippled through my back. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to look back to know it was very close. Branches whipped my face. My breath turned into a thick white mist. My heart pounded wildly so hard I thought it would explode. I slipped, nearly falling. An invisible hand seemed to pull me up, not strength but fear. I lunged through the trees, trying to zigzag according to an old hunter's instinct. Change direction, weave through the terrain, find anything that could slow it down. A roar sounded right behind me, so close I could feel its hot breath through my jacket in the biting cold. I turned my head briefly and regretted it immediately. It was there. I wanted to fire, but my hands were shaking too much to pull the trigger. The bear lunged. It had gone mad from my intrusion. It was massive, faster than I thought. Its black eyes locked onto me as the only target in the world. The distance between us was closing every second. I knew I couldn't run forever. And in that moment of despair, a thought flashed, not a plan, just the last reflex of someone who had survived too many times. Find high ground. I darted my eyes frantically around my lungs, feeling like they were on fire. And then I saw it. A rock ledge protruding amidst the forest covered in snow, but high enough to create distance. A thin hope, but the only one I had. I put all my remaining strength into changing direction, heading straight for it. Behind me, the roar sounded again, closer this time, more violent, as if the monster behind knew its prey was about to slip from its claws. And for the first time since pulling the trigger, a chilling thought ran down my spine. Perhaps I just traded my life for a creature the world calls a monster. But in that moment, I had no way back. The rock ledge was higher than I thought, but also further than I imagined. Every step now wasn't running, but struggling. The snow sank to my calves, dragging me back like quicksand. My lungs burned. Every breath was like swallowing a cold blade. Behind me, the bear's footsteps still thundered. Heavy, steady, not hurried but certain. It knew I couldn't go far. I slipped once more my knee, slamming hard against the ice crust. Pain shot up to my brain. A roar sounded right behind me, nearly freezing me in place. There was no more time. I scrambled up, nearly throwing myself toward the ledge. My hands touched the freezing stone, rough and covered in ice. I clung to it like it was the last thing left in this world. I quickly climbed up. I didn't dare look below, and even prayed I wouldn't have to pay for this stupid action. I kicked my legs, pulling myself up, fingernails scratching into the ice until they bled. My boots slipped on the slick surface, but I kept pulling, kept clinging, as if I stopped for just a second, I would disappear from this world. A heavy slam below. The ledge shook. I screamed instinctively, gripping tighter, my whole body tensed. I knew it was right beneath my feet. I pulled one more time, exerting every last bit of strength, then rolled onto the flat top of the ledge. I lay there, face up to the white sky, heart beating frantically. Cold air cut into my lungs, but I still breathed like I had never breathed before. Then I heard it, heavy breathing below. I slowly inched to the edge of the rock and looked down. The bear was there, right beneath me. Its breath puffed out in white clouds. Its snout was stained with blood. It wasn't clear if it was the Bigfoot's or its own. It looked up at me. Its eyes were no longer as crazed as during the pursuit. There was only the annoyance, the frustration of a predator that had just been robbed of its prey. It roared, lunging its claws at the rock face. But the ledge was too steep, too slick. It couldn't climb up, but it didn't give up. It continuously used its sharp claws to attack the rock, to threaten me. At this moment, this was no longer a battle between Bigfoot and the bear, but a battle between me and this crazed grizzly. I used the butt of my rifle repeatedly, striking at its nose, the bear's sensitive spot. A minute passed, or 10, I don't know. Time then was distorted like my own breath. Finally, the bear lowered its head. It stood still for a long time, as if considering. Then it turned. A slow and heavy action. It turned and left, not forgetting to give me a warning look. It vanished amidst the snow-covered trunks, its massive shadow gradually dissolving into the white veil. I still didn't dare move, didn't dare believe it had gone, until the forest returned to silence. No more roars, no more footsteps, only the wind blowing through the frozen branches, whistling thin and cold sounds. I lay there for a long time, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know if it was from the cold or from just escaping death. Then a thought slowly crept into my head. Bigfoot. I wonder how he's doing. I jumped up, heart beating fast again. In the rush to escape, I had forgotten the reason I pulled the trigger. Less than 15 feet in front of me. He was still there, the creature I had mocked my whole life in stories around the campfire. The creature I thought existed only in the imagination of those who like to exaggerate. And now, amidst the white forest, I was standing face to face with him, not as a hunter meeting prey, but as two survivors who had just escaped the same nightmare. The Bigfoot didn't attack, but he didn't run either. He stood frozen, his body hunched over, as if he no longer had enough strength to keep his balance. His chest heaved violently, each heavy breath escaping as white mist in the sub-zero air. Each time he inhaled, his shoulder convulsed in pain. Blood was still flowing slow but unceasing, dyeing the fur already frozen with cold. We looked at each other. For the first time in my life, I understood the feeling of being looked at by something completely alien. His gaze was unlike any animal's I had encountered in the forest. There was no cold wildness of a wolf, no instinctive vacancy of a deer, and no mindless ferocity of a bear. In his eyes, there was thought, and that sent a chill down my spine. I lightly gripped the rifle but didn't raise it. For some reason, I knew if I aimed the gun now, everything would shatter. Not because he would attack, but because I would turn this moment into a hunt, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be a hunter anymore. Then he moved slightly, just a tiny shift, but enough to make my heart thud against my ribs. He didn't lunge. He didn't turn away. He just shifted one leg, then halted, as if his body no longer obeyed him. A low groan escaped his throat, sounding not like a beast sound, but like the sound of a being trying to suppress pain. In that moment, I understood something. He was afraid of me, realizing that was even scarier than him attacking. I saw clearly in his eyes something very familiar, something I had seen in animals cornered in a trap. Not anger, not aggression, but the desperate alertness of a being that knows it could die at any moment. But unlike other animals, he didn't look at me as he would a predator. He looked at me as if trying to understand me. That feeling made my hands shake. I suddenly realized I was in a situation without precedent in my hunting life. No rules, no experience. No one taught me what to do when standing before a creature half human, half myth, dying in the middle of the forest. I swallowed hard. My throat was dry from the cold and tension. The rifle in my hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy. The Bigfoot blinked. His breath trembled. His shoulder dropped a bit more, as if just one more minute and he would collapse into the snow. A new stream of blood seeped from the shoulder wound, flowing down his long arm and then dripping onto the white snow, spreading like red ink on paper. The Bigfoot still looked at me. That gaze didn't force me to do anything, but it was that very silence that made every decision feel heavier. I suddenly understood that this moment wouldn't last forever. Either I would do something or he would fall. There was no third choice. In that moment, I knew I had crossed an invisible boundary, no longer a hunter facing prey, but a human, standing before a being in pain and fear, and perhaps also trying to understand me just as I was trying to understand him. I knew I had to do something, and that made my hands shake. Slowly, very slowly, I lowered the rifle to my hip. A simple motion, but I felt like I was putting down an entire part of my old self. The Bigfoot noticed. I clearly saw his shoulder contract slightly, then release. He still didn't step forward, but he didn't back away either. I swallowed hard. My throat was dry. "Easy," I muttered, not knowing if I was talking to him or to myself. My voice was hoarse from the cold, and fear sounding small enough to be carried away by the wind. But I kept speaking slowly, like how I used to talk to panicked horses or injured dogs. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." I knew he didn't understand the words, but some things don't need language. Tone, breathing, the way the body moves. I slowly knelt on one knee, lowering myself so as not to appear threatening. Cold snow immediately soaked through my thick pants, but I didn't care. The only thing I noticed was his reaction. He only tilted his head very slightly, as if trying to read something in my actions. That moment made my heart beat faster, because for the first time I didn't feel like I was taming an animal. It felt like trying to communicate with a conscious being, a being that was considering. I slowly removed my gloves. My hand immediately stung like pins and needles when it touched the sub-zero air, but I did it anyway. A bare hand in the wild is the clearest sign that you aren't preparing to attack. I raised my hand a little palm toward him, a simple gesture. No weapon, no threat. The Bigfoot stared at my hand. His eyes followed every small movement, not missing a single detail. I saw his throat move as he swallowed, as if he himself was tense. A strong gust of wind blew past, making me shiver, but I didn't withdraw my hand. We stood there, one kneeling in the snow, one giant bleeding creature framed in a moment I never imagined would exist. Then the Bigfoot moved, not stepping forward, only relaxing a bit more. His shoulders dropped, his jaw no longer as tight as before. His breath was still heavy, but the rhythm was slower. He still looked at me, but his gaze was no longer as sharp as a knife. Instead was something hard to name. Hesitation. Wavering. I clearly felt that change, and that was what made me decide to take one more step. I inched forward, just half a step. The snow crunched under my knee, a small sound, but it rang out clearly in the quiet space. My heart beat so hard, I was sure he heard it too. The Bigfoot immediately tensed up again, his shoulders bunched, muscles under the thick fur standing out. A very small growl escaped his throat, not to threaten, but like an instinctive warning. I froze. "Okay, okay," I whispered, staying in position. I didn't advance further, nor did I back away, just stayed there on the fragile line of trust. After several endless seconds, his body relaxed again. Not completely, but enough for me to know I hadn't broken anything. I exhaled slow and long, trying to keep my breath stable. In my head were no longer thoughts about myths, about hunting, about right or wrong. Only one thing was clear: the being in front of me was hurting, and if I didn't do anything, he would die. Everything else suddenly became brutally simple. No more Bigfoot, no more monster, only an injured being, and a human who could help. I looked at the bloodstains spreading on his shoulder, then looked back into his eyes. That gaze was still wary, but no longer closed off as before. He didn't come closer to me, but he didn't turn away either. As if he was waiting to see what I was, a hunter or something else. I swallowed hard, feeling my heart heavy in my chest. "All right, I just want to help you," I whispered, clearer this time, as if speaking to both of us. Then very slowly I lowered the rifle onto the snow completely. It was no longer in my hands. The moment the metal touched the cold snow, a strange feeling spread through my chest, both fear and relief, as if I had just let go of something that had followed me my whole life. The Bigfoot looked down at the rifle, then back at me. His gaze changed. Not clearly, not dramatically, but I saw somewhere very deep a spark had just been lit. Not complete trust, but fragile hope. Between the cold, lethal, snowy forest, between two beings never born to understand each other, an invisible bridge had just been laid down, and I knew. I had chosen not to stand on the human side, nor to stand on the myth's side. I just chose not to turn my back on a being that needed to live. With the rifle left in the snow, I knew there was no way back. I stopped about 6 feet from him, close enough to see every detail, and close enough to die if I was wrong. The smell of metallic blood mixed with the smell of wet fur and the metallic scent of cold snow hit my nose. Only now did I see the wound clearly. His left shoulder was torn open, the thick fur matted with clotted blood and ice. The bite was so deep I could see the dark red muscle beneath. A human with such a wound would have been dead long ago. But he still stood here, enduring. I swallowed hard, then slowly removed my backpack from my shoulders. Every movement had to be slow, intentional. I didn't dare take my eyes off him, fearing that just one hasty motion could ruin everything. The Bigfoot followed my every move. When I unzipped it, he startled slightly, muscles under the fur tensed. A very small growl escaped his throat. I immediately stopped. "It's okay, it's okay," I whispered, though knowing he didn't understand the words. I held my position for several seconds, then continued slowly. Bit by bit, I opened the small first aid kit I always carried on long trips. A survivor's habit. In the forest, you are either prepared or dead. As I took out the gauze roll, a strong gust of wind blew past, making the fur on his shoulder sway. He shuddered, his breath heavier. I knew I didn't have much time. If the wound was left open in this cold, he would die of blood loss or infection, if not the cold first. I held up the cloth slowly so he could see clearly what I was holding. The Bigfoot watched intently. His gaze moved from the cloth to my face, then back to the cloth, as if he were trying to understand. I reached out my hand very slowly, palm open, to show him every movement. As my hand neared his shoulder, my heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint. The final distance. I stopped, waiting for his next reaction. The Bigfoot froze, his breath puffing out in thick white clouds. His deep black eyes looked straight at me, unblinking. In that moment, I saw clearly the struggle within him, the instinct to flee, and the exhaustion pulling him back. Then, he didn't move, didn't resist, didn't attack. He just stood there and then nodded as if accepting my help. I touched him. For the first time in my life, I touched a Bigfoot. I used to think they didn't exist, but now I was touching one. His fur was thicker and coarser than I imagined, cold and damp from ice. But beneath that fur was warmth, a real living warmth pulsing through my fingertips like an electric shock. He wasn't a legend. He was alive. The Bigfoot jerked slightly as I touched him, muscles contracting. A deep grunt escaped his throat, not a roar, but like a pain reflex. "Sorry," I whispered instinctively. I began cleaning the clotted blood around the wound, using a damp cloth to dab lightly. Each time I touched deeper, he groaned softly, his body tensing, but he still didn't shove me away. That made my hands shake more. I have performed first aid on humans, animals, and myself, but never for something like this. His body structure amazed me. Beneath the thick fur and skin was clear musculature, more like a human than any animal I had ever seen. The shoulder joint, the way the bone moved, the elasticity of the flesh, all sent a chill down my spine. He wasn't a beast, at least, not entirely. I took out the gauze, pressing lightly on the wound to stop the bleeding. This time, the Bigfoot groaned more clearly, head tilted back, jaw clenched. His breath became rapid, each rhythm vibrating in the cold air. I stopped for a second, looked into his eyes, and what I saw made my heart tighten. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was pure pain, just like any living being that is injured. I gritted my teeth and continued. I wrapped the bandage around his shoulder over his back, pulling tight enough to hold the gauze in place. Each time the cloth tightened, he groaned softly but didn't resist. He endured, as if understanding I was trying to help. As I reached around his back to tie the knot, I clearly felt his hot breath right above my head. Just by leaning down, those jaws could bite me like prey. But he didn't. He stood still. Let me touch him, trusting in a fragile way that I almost couldn't believe was real. I tied the final knot and then slowly withdrew my hands. We both stood still for a few seconds, as if needing time to understand what had just happened. The wind still blew, the snow still fell, but amidst that storm something had changed. The Bigfoot lowered his eyes to look at the bandage on his shoulder. He tilted his head very slightly, as if feeling the strange object wrapped around his body. Then He did something I will never forget. He raised his hand slowly and touched my hand. It was just a very light touch, but enough to stun me. His hand was large and rough, the skin thick and calloused like bark. But that touch didn't carry power, only trembling. A short moment, but I clearly felt something transmitted through the skin, not words, not predatory instinct, but awareness. He knew what I had just done, and in his own way, he understood. I dared not move, dared not breathe hard, just stood there letting my hand lie beneath the hand of a being I had thought my whole life only existed in campfire stories. Then he withdrew his hand very slowly, as if afraid of hurting me. That moment passed as fast as a blink, but it etched into me more than any memory in my life. Between the cold, lethal, snowy forest, between two beings with no common language, we had just shared something wordless, and for the first time since entering the forest that day, I no longer felt I was standing before a legend. I was standing before a being that knew pain, knew fear, and knew thanks. I don't know how long we sat there. Time had no meaning. No sun, no shadows, no sound other than the wind and the breathing of the two beings at this moment. But then I realized the first thing to change. The Bigfoot moved. Initially just a very small movement. His shoulder shook slightly as if the body were trying to regain strength. He took a deep breath, chest heaving under thick fur. His breath puffed out in heavy white clouds. He leaned down to look at the wound on his shoulder. The bandage I tied was more soaked in red than before, but the blood was no longer flowing. He touched the bandage very lightly as if afraid of hurting himself. Then he tried to stand up. That moment made my heart tighten. The Bigfoot braced his hands in the snow, putting weight into his remaining arm. The muscles on his back and shoulder tensed under the fur, every vein standing out. He hoisted himself up bit by bit, slowly, like someone who had just survived an accident. When he was half standing, his body stalled. A deep groan escaped his throat, not loud, but enough for me to feel the pain spreading in the air. He almost fell. I nearly stood up reflexively, but then held back. I knew I couldn't run over to support him like I would a person. Not from fear, but because I didn't know if that touch would break the fragile balance between us. The Bigfoot dug his feet into the snow, gasping for air. Each breath seemed to pull his entire body into a tremor. But then, bit by bit, he stood straight, still terrifying in the way of nature, but no longer the fear I once knew. He stood there for several seconds, as if to get his body used to its own weight again. The wind blew through, making his fur sway like grass in a storm. Then he turned his head to look at me. That moment made it so I couldn't breathe. The distance between us wasn't far, just a few paces, but his gaze made everything seem to slow down, no longer panicked, no longer alert. There was only a deep stillness. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there, hands hanging by my sides, no gun, no knife, no anything in hand, just a human standing in the forest looking at what I had thought my whole life was a legend. The Bigfoot looked at me for a long time, so long that I began to notice every small detail. His gaze wasn't pitch black as I had imagined, but had depth, a deep brown reflecting the pale light of the winter sky. Snow clung to his eyelashes, melting and then freezing into small ice beads. He blinked, a very human motion, and that made me choke up. I didn't know what he thought, didn't know how much he understood about what had just happened, but I knew one thing: he was looking at me, and not as prey. The Bigfoot tilted his head very slightly, a small motion but containing something hard to name. Not a predator's gesture, not instinctive behavior, but like a realization. I didn't know why, but I nodded, without thinking, without calculating, just a natural reflex, like when you say goodbye to someone you know you won't see again. We stood there facing each other, wordless, and then he turned away. Not suddenly, not hurriedly. He just turned very slowly, each heavy step imprinted in the thick snow. His footprints were large and deep, each step as if pulling the weight of the whole forest. I watched him, unable to take my eyes off him. The Bigfoot walked with more difficulty than I imagined. The injured shoulder made him lean slightly to one side. Each step carried a bit of a limp. But he didn't stop, didn't turn his head. He headed toward the deep forest where the black pines stood crowded like ghosts amidst the white veil of snow. The wind swirled snow around his legs, erasing the tracks as soon as he stepped. Nature is always like that, swallowing everything, leaving no evidence. I wanted to call him, not to hold him back, not to ask anything. Just a strange instinct, like when you watch someone leave after something too big. But I didn't open my mouth, because I knew there are moments that shouldn't be broken with words. The Bigfoot went a few feet, then slowed down. My heart suddenly squeezed. He stopped standing still amidst the snow curtain. Then very slowly he turned his head back. Just once. Our eyes met for the last time. It was just a silent moment where everything seemed to stop. The wind still blew. The snow still fell, but in that second everything blurred. I didn't know what I was looking at, a beast, an ancient being, or just a survivor like me. But I knew one thing, that gaze wasn't empty. It held something very real. Then he turned away, this time without stopping again. He stepped into a thicker curtain of snow where the forest began to swallow his form. Step by step, that massive figure became fainter, blending into the trunks and the darkness of the deep woods, until he was gone. No trace, no sound, only falling snow. I stood still for a long time after, just looking at the space where he just stood, as if I waited long enough, he would step out again from that white screen. But nothing happened. Only the wind and the forest returned to its familiar silence, that cold, deep silence, as if what just happened had never existed. I leaned down to look at the snow beneath my feet. His footprints had almost entirely faded. The snow was erasing everything, and I understood. If I left here, there would be nothing to prove that moment ever existed besides my memory. A feeling of emptiness rose in my chest. Not sadness, not relief, but a silence so deep I didn't know its name. I stood there amidst the endless snowy forest, realizing I had just witnessed something that the rest of the world would probably never believe. A wordless farewell, just two beings passing through each other's lives in a storm, then vanishing from each other's worlds forever. And as I turned to leave, I knew one thing. No matter how long I live, the moment he turned his head to look at me one last time, amidst that whiteout storm, will always remain. After leaving the forest that day, I didn't return to my old life immediately. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. Everything inside me had changed. I remember very clearly the moment the car left the dirt road leading out of the sanctuary. As the trees gradually receded behind, I felt like I had just left a part of my soul there. Not regret, but an indescribable void. The first days back, I barely slept. I tried to return to work, but nothing felt the same. The deep forest footage I used to view as documentation now felt like personal memories. Each time I looked at the screen, I no longer saw a documentary subject. I saw him. I saw that gaze. That quiet gaze, not fierce at all, but not belonging to the human world either. And what bothered me most wasn't fear. It was a feeling of missing him. I didn't talk about this with anyone, not because I feared they wouldn't believe, but because I knew they wouldn't understand. How can one explain that they miss a being that science hasn't even confirmed exists? How to tell others that what kept me awake wasn't a nightmare, but the memory of a silent moment in the woods, when two species looked at each other as if they had known each other for a very long time. I tried to write everything down, Initially, I thought recording it would help unburden my heart. I opened the computer, created a new file, then sat for hours before a blank screen. But every time I typed a few lines, I deleted them, because I realized one thing. If I recounted everything straightforwardly, this story would turn into something else, a sensation, a clickbait video, evidence for those hunting the mysterious. And I didn't want that. Not because I feared being mocked, but because I feared someone would go back to that forest, feared that one day where I once stood silent amidst the mist would be full of people, full of cameras, full of excited screams. And if that happened, I knew for sure one thing would vanish forever. I turned down several projects, especially those related to mysterious creatures. Before that was the subject I always pursued. But after that trip, I no longer had interest in proving anything. I no longer wanted to hunt. Occasionally, I go back and watch the old footage. The segments never publicized, not to edit a film, but just to remember that everything that happened was real. There is one segment I have never shown anyone. It's not the clearest scene, nor the strongest evidence. It's just a very short frame. In it, amidst the thin mist, a tall figure stands still at the forest edge, not approaching nor turning to leave, just standing there, as if watching us. Every time I watch it, I always stop at that exact moment, because I fear if I look closer, I will ruin the feeling that memory brings. Many people ask me if that trip was worth it. Some think I lost my job because of it. Some think I missed an opportunity for fame. Some even say I missed the biggest discovery of my life. But they don't know. I never considered it a discovery. It was a meeting. And like every important meeting in life, what remains is not evidence, but an echo. Until now, I'm still not sure what I learned from that experience. Maybe humility, maybe fear of nature, or maybe just realizing that this world is larger than what we see. But there is one thing I know very well. Since that day, I no longer look at the forest as I did before. Every time I stand before a deep forest, I no longer think about what I will find inside. I wonder if something is looking back at me. And every time that thought appears, I remember that misty morning. Remember the way he turned away without making a sound. Remember the moment the boundary between human and wild became strangely fragile. Perhaps I will never go back to that place, not from fear, but because I want to keep that memory intact, as it inherently exists, not proven, not dissected, not turned into a story to debate, just a small secret, lying somewhere between the deep woods and my memory. And sometimes on very quiet nights when the city is asleep and all sounds gradually settle, I still feel like I'm hearing the wind blow through distant canopies, so light as if not real, but enough to make me wonder if somewhere out there in the forests we have never touched, someone is still walking in silence. Many years have passed since the day I left that forest. My life, at least on the surface, looks quite normal. I still make films, still go on shoots, still appear in meetings, small interviews. To outsiders, the story of that year was just a strange phase in my career, a failed trip, an unfinished project. I let people believe that. But the truth is, I have never told it all, not because I want to keep a secret to create mystery, nor because I fear mockery, but because there are things that if spoken cannot be taken back. Throughout the years following, I have many times wondered if I should tell the whole story, not the edited version, not the safe, abridged version I shared in a few interviews, but the full truth. The truth I kept back. There are nights I have reopened the old hard drive where all the data from the trip is stored, not just the footage I used to rewatch, but everything. Unnamed files, recordings mixed with noise, shaky frames I previously thought were useless. And every time I open them, I realize one thing. The story never ended at the moment of parting in the woods. It lasted much longer than that. What I have never told anyone is that after the day I left, I still went back. Not immediately. It took nearly a year. A year where I tried to live as if nothing had happened. I threw myself into work, took new projects, went to noisier cities, tried to fill the void with a fast pace of life. But the harder I tried to forget, the clearer the memory became. Not an image, but a feeling. The feeling of standing in the forest, knowing I wasn't alone, but also wasn't threatened. And finally I went back alone. I didn't go back to prove anything. I went back because of a wordless promise. The forest then was still the same. Still those towering trunks, still the familiar damp earth smell, still the silence that makes one feel as if they are entering another world. But this time I no longer had the feeling of fear or suspense as before. There was only an unusual calm, as if I were returning to a place that once belonged to me. I walked for a long time, almost by instinct. No map, no clear landmarks. But strangely, I always knew I was going in the right direction. There are memories that the body remembers better than reason. And then I found it. Not a cave, not a footprint, not anything clear like the first time. Just a clearing in the forest. A small, open patch of ground where light filtered down into long streaks through the canopy. Stepping into it, I had a hauntingly familiar feeling, exactly like the moment we once met years ago. I stood there for a long time. I didn't know what I was waiting for, and then I heard it. Not a clear footstep, just a very faint sound, like a branch being lightly touched, like dry leaves being stepped on. If it were a few years before, maybe I would have raised my gun immediately. But then I did nothing. I just stood still, letting my heart rate slow down. And then I saw him. Not clearly like the first time, not close enough to see every detail, just a large figure among the trunks appearing and then standing still in the shade, not approaching but not leaving either. How long that moment lasted, I don't know. Maybe just a few seconds, maybe several minutes. Time in the forest is always strange like that. What I remember most wasn't his shape, it was the feeling. No more fear, no more bewilderment, only something very quiet, very deep, as if both understood that this wasn't an encounter. We stood there looking at each other from afar, not approaching, not turning to run, until he tilted his head slightly, then backed deeper into the forest, so slowly he nearly dissolved into the darkness, just vanished, as if he had never appeared. I stood there long after he left. This time I didn't feel I had just lost anything. On the contrary, I felt like I had just completed a circle. And that is what I have never told anyone. The answer is very simple. Because there are truths that do not need to be proven. After that time, I didn't go back anymore. I had the answer I sought, not the answer about what he was, where he came from, or if he was real, but the answer about boundaries, the boundary between humans and nature, between exploration and intrusion, between knowing and accepting not knowing. Now, sitting here retelling this story, I don't expect people to believe me completely. I also don't hope this story becomes evidence for anything. I just want to retell it, as it inherently existed, an incomplete experience, an immeasurable truth, a secret I have kept in silence for many years. Maybe out there are still many forests humans have never set foot in, many things we don't understand, haven't seen, haven't touched. And perhaps not all need to be found, because sometimes what makes a story truly meaningful is not the fact that we proved it, but the fact that we were once there, once saw, once were silent, and chose to keep that silence as a part of ourselves.
Hello everyone, I am Mike, host of the Sasquatch Story channel, where we together listen to the strangest stories from deep in the North American forests. You just heard the story of Harold Jenkins, a hunter who all his life didn't believe in the mystical until the day he saw a Bigfoot being attacked by a bear. What haunts me most isn't whether Bigfoot exists or not, but the moment Harold had to choose: turn his back according to the law of survival, or help a creature the whole world calls a monster. And he chose compassion. Perhaps the biggest lesson from this story doesn't lie in Bigfoot. It lies in us. In the harshest circumstances, what defines a human is not strength, but how we treat those lives weaker than ourselves. Sometimes what makes you different isn't what you believe, but what you dare to do when no one is watching. And I also want to remind you, Harold's story has been edited by the Sasquatch Story team from the original account, and we used AI to generate illustrative images and videos, aiming to make your experience more vivid and cinematic. But the emotions and message the story brings remain the most authentic. How about you? Have you ever experienced something that science cannot explain? A moment in the forest, a strange sound in the middle of the night, or a gaze you can't forget? If so, please share in the comments section or send your story to the channel's email. Who knows, the next story to appear on Sasquatch Story might just be yours. If you enjoy stories like these, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next mysterious journeys. I am Mike, and see you in the next story, where mysteries never truly sleep.